Welcome back to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and this is our literature series, which of course is getting closer to its end as the summer comes to an end, and also why it's so appropriate to have today's guest on the podcast. This is Bruce Fulton. Now, it's hard to properly introduce someone like Bruce and his place within the field of Korean literature. Whatever I say and however I try to describe him, it's simply not going to do justice to the place he holds. If anyone out there has a book, an edited volume, an anthology of Korean literature, it likely has Bruce's name on it. Just as is the case if you have any significant volume of Korean literature. His output is phenomenal, and he's been doing this for decade upon decade. And he is also the inaugural holder of the Yang Bin Min Chair in Korean Literature and Literary Translation in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. And also appropriately, based on this background, we're going to have a broad look at Korean literature in general. Its development throughout its entire history, its different phases, its different types, how it's changed, the influences upon it. And also, luckily enough, this was an incredibly long podcast, so I'm going to break it up into two sections, simply to make it more easily digestible. In this first episode, we are going to focus on that history, that deep look into the origins of Korean literature, and how it has changed, its early oral and performative nature, its change into lyrics, its didactic and oral forms, how it changes into narrative, the place of Hangul and Hanmun. And we're going to build this history up all the way past the colonial period and post-1945. And I should offer a few small disclaimers here. This podcast was recorded a week ago, so when Bruce makes reference to Liberation Day, the national holiday inside Korea, that is why he's doing it. And also, if the audio quality is slightly reduced, it's simply because we had to record this via phone line as well. But the most important disclaimer that I can give here, and I must give here, are the running mistakes that I personally made throughout this podcast. When Bruce does his translation, he is part of a translation team. He does it with his wife, Bruce Fulton. And also the book that we're going to base this historical part of the podcast on, and what is recently released, is the book, What is Korean Literature? And again, this is written by Bruce, but it is co-written with Kwang Young Min. And at almost every step in this podcast, when I make reference to translation to these books, I exclude both of these co-authors again and again and again. Now, often when I do, Bruce has the good grace to often correct what I don't have the good grace to say. But just as a disclaimer, and for those interested in the books, which are going to be linked below, these are co-authored books and co-authored translations. And now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We don't run advertising in any way. So if you do support the podcast and you do want it to continue, it's important that you visit the links below and do whatever you can to help us along. On that, and to talk us through the history, the origin, and the development and the changes within Korean literature, this is Bruce Fulton. Bruce Fulton, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you so much, Jed. And it's great to conduct this discussion on the 75th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Imperial Japan. So I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely. It's a national holiday over here. So yeah, an important date. And you are an important guest. As soon as I started thinking about a literature series, I knew I had to at least reach out to you because as I was saying pre-interview, I've got 5 or so books on my shelf that just accumulated over the years that have your name on it. And I'm assuming many other people out there do. You have a huge history and a huge body of work within this field. So before we get started, before we get into the real rub of the interview, I might get you to introduce yourself. You've got this really long history on the Korean Peninsula dating back to 1978, I believe. So I might get you to start off just by introducing yourself and your work.
Sure, and I thank you for the kind words. I like to respond with a Korean expression that of humility that comes out as something like I'm about as significant as a rat's tail, and the reason I say that is because I was born in the year of the rat, 1948. So, but I do thank you for that, for your kind words. And yes, my history with Korea goes back to 1978. A little over 40 years ago, I arrived in Korea as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer, knowing very little about Korea. And I'm often asked, how did I end up in Korea? And The only explanation I have is that it's what we call inyan, or prior connection, and that results from my having been born on October 9th, which, as you may know, is Korean Alphabet Day, or Hangulal, sometimes celebrated as a national holiday, depending on who the current president is. So I like to mention that I was born on the day in 1446 when great King Sejong promulgated, or officially introduced to the people of Chosun, the remarkable script that we believe he himself had played a major role in creating. And I think this term inyan, or prior connection, along with what we might call uyan, or chance, or serendipity, explains a lot of how I became involved with Korean literature. And I should state at the outset that although you were talking to one individual about translation of Korean literature, for, I would say, 90 to 95% of my translation work has been with my good wife, Bruce Fulton. So right off the bat, I need to make sure that all your listeners understand that it's not just me who's been involved in this over 4 decades, but Juchan as well. Through a combination of good luck, Juchan and I ended up being introduced to the works of Hwang Sun-won, who I regard as Korea's preeminent, most accomplished writer of short fiction. I ended up writing my dissertation at Seoul National University on his short fiction. And he, in turn, introduced us to 3 women writers, and that became, those writers became the focus of our first book-length publication in the U.S. Back in the 1980s. And since then, we've branched out to a variety of authors, but several we've maintained a relationship with over the decades. And then in the 1990s, I completed my PhD program. So now I guess I'm what you might think of as the literary counterpart of a medical doctor who teaches at a university and also has a private practice. I hope that doesn't come off sounding too arrogant, but I think it's a good way of understanding what I've been doing since 1999, when I began teaching at the University of British Columbia.
Yes, that is a great way to look at it, actually, especially just how much work. And of course, I should have mentioned your wife as well at the start, because her name is, of course, across all of those books. And let's launch into what we're going to speak about today, which is a broad look at Korean literature. So you've recently published a broad look at the subject titled "What is Korean Literature?" Yeah. I'll link it below. So
yes, and I should emphasize that that this book originated in a manuscript by Professor Kwon Young-min, and Professor Kwon is someone that Juchan and I have known since the mid-1980s. And he became my supervisor in my PhD program at Seoul National University. And we have collaborated. We had previously collaborated on a short fiction anthology, the one published by Columbia University Press about 15 years ago. We have worked together on translation workshops, on workshops and conferences featuring junior scholars, and but I want to emphasize that What is Korean Literature began with a manuscript that Professor Kwon wrote. And not quite 10 years ago, he began, with the help of graduate students at Seoul National University, to create an English language version. And I happened to be on sabbatical in Korea in 2011, and that marks my my joining into the project. And several years ago, we agreed that we would work together to create a book, and were able to secure publication through the Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where Professor Kwon has been teaching for the last 5 or 6 or 7 years after he retired from Seoul National University. So that's how that book came about, and it is a co-authored book.
And it is an extraordinary book. And of course, we're going to get to a few other books that you've written as well later on. But let's start with that history. There's so much deep history in this book. So let's start at the very beginning here, which is pre-modern literature. And so what does pre-modern literature, the very earliest Korean literature, look like?
Well, I like to use the word traditional instead of pre-modern, and because tradition, there's a great word in Korean, jantong, that refers to Korean tradition in general. But another reason I like that word is that it reminds us that although today what we know about Korean literature is Korean recorded literature, the Korean literary tradition begins with orality, with the oral tradition, and with performance. And I always like to point out that the very first mention of the Korean people in the Chinese histories. Now, we all know that one of the remarkable achievements of Chinese civilization are the various historical compendiums that have come down to us from the various dynasties. And as far as we know, the earliest reference to the inhabitants of the Korean Peninsula is the references to heaven-worshipping ceremonies. And each of the three kingdoms that were united by Silla, had a distinctive heaven-worshipping ceremony that involved movement and song and orality. And movement has always been thought as an essential part of oral literature, in that supposedly the gods or the spirits are more easily persuaded when they can see some motion rather than hearing words, or just hearing words in song. So that's where the tradition began, and it was. We can assume that it was centuries or perhaps millennia before Chinese characters made their way onto the Korean Peninsula, which marks the start of Korean recorded literature. So the point is, and this is something I like to emphasize as well, that in the new millennium, when what we know of Korean literature is Korean recorded literature, and what we increasingly know about Korean tradition is popular culture, we should be aware that both Korean literature and, more broadly, Korean culture derive from orality and performativity.
And so this is the history, I'm assuming, the origins of this pansori as well, I'm assuming.
The origins of, pansori. Yes, very much. Very, very much so.
So let's step beyond that a little bit and go into another phase of this history. So let's step into verse and classical literature through this traditional literature through verse. And I read here, it's an interesting line of yours, which you write. It's characterized by a mythic worldview that involves the continuity between the mortal and the divine. So when it does become verse, when Korean literature changes from oral to verse, how does it look in this way? I'd like you to open up this idea of this continuity between this mortal realm and this divine realm above.
Well, if you're asking how it looks on the printed page, we can distinguish between verse written in that was originally oral, of course, and then ultimately recorded in Hangul. But there's also a very strong tradition of poetry written in classical Chinese. But I tend to differentiate between the two, and when I think of verse, I'm thinking of the Korean term shiga, shi meaning poetry and ga meaning song. So how it looks depends on what genre you're engaging with, and these genres range from the very short and structured shijo form, which has a set number of syllables, to longer forms that have no limit on length and are much more flexible in terms of subject matter, called kasa. And an interesting thing about kasa, kasa literally means the ga of kasa is the same ga of shiga, the song, and sa are words. So kasa literally means sung words, which also is a reminder that, like shijo, kasa were originally meant to be sung or perhaps chanted, and only later were written down. But kasa is also the words for K-pop song lyrics. So once again, we have a very appropriate connection between K-pop and Korean popular culture and traditional, and in this case, native Korean literature that is native to the Korean Peninsula, and as opposed to works of prose and poetry written in Chinese.
So there is a famous text that emerges very early in this traditional history of Korean literature that many people may have heard of, the Samguk Yuksa, the Three Kingdoms story. So how important is this central text, and what tradition does it come from? Because you wrote somewhere here, that I have it in front of me, that some of the oral traditions survive within this text.
Yes. So Samguk Yusa is usually considered to be our oldest extant non-official work of writing in Korean, as opposed to the Samguk Sagi, which was an official history that came out around, I think, roughly around the same time, give or take a century or two. The Samguk Yusa is attributed to a Buddhist monk named Irian, and it's a treasure for those of us who wish to understand the origins of Korean literature, because it consists of a number of stories that are built around our earliest examples of native literature, that is, literature that originated on the peninsula rather than being written in Chinese, and those are the songs that we call hyanga, hyang meaning Gohyang, or ancestral home, and Ga, once again, the word that means song. So the Hyangga by themselves are quite short and can be appreciated in a number of ways, but the stories that come out of the oral tradition that have become attached to these Hyangga are a great source of not just entertainment but of knowledge of what life was like in Korea at the time, the life of the nobility, the life of the commoners, and so this is a treasure trove of Korean tradition for sure.
So, pausing on those early moments in Korean literature, as you mentioned, it is largely Chinese when it first began, so it's classical Chinese, so Hanmun. And so I might get you to begin to walk us towards the time when classical Chinese begins to change into the modern Korean, into Korean or into Hangul. So it doesn't start early. It is introduced early, but it doesn't start early. So let's talk about that changeover period when classical Chinese begins to also find itself alongside the Korean script at the same time on the peninsula.
Okay, so we're talking about probably a little more than 1,000 years between the introduction of writing in Chinese to the Korean Peninsula and the appearance on my birthday in 1446 of Hangul. But what we have to realize is that the reason that Hangul is so important is that until its creation, only a very, very tiny percentage of the inhabitants of the Korean Peninsula were literate, and almost all of that tiny percentage who were literate were men. Why? Because literacy and mastery of classical Chinese was necessary in order to enter the bureaucracy by way of the government civil service examination. And when Hangul was made available to the people of Chosun, then the great majority of the people who did not have access to classical Chinese theoretically had access to Hangul, but we have to remember that not until the modern period were a majority of the people literate even in Hangul. In fact, some estimates of the literacy rate in the colonial period, as late as the 1930s, are about 10%. So the story of Hangul and writing in Chinese is more a story of kind of a coexistence, might perhaps easy or uneasy, depending on the individual, that lasts pretty much until the end of Chosun. So we're talking about, well over 4 centuries of coexistence. And it wasn't really until late in the Chosun period, when the winds of change began to sweep across East Asia, that the people of Chosun realized that their cultural integrity, independence was in danger, and there happened a rather rapid shift from Chinese, from classical Chinese sinographs to the native script Hangul as a means kind of cultural integrity. So To get a better idea of this, I'll mention one or two perhaps stereotypes. One is that a cultured Confucian gentleman who had rank in the bureaucracy would do all of his official writing, but also a lot of writing intended for his colleagues in Chinese. But perhaps in private, might lapse into the native script to write, say, Shizhou or Kasa, or occasionally fictional narratives in Hangul. But it was always a mark of an educated man's erudition would be his achievement in classical Chinese, which is why we have such a rich amount of writing, especially in poetry, in classical Chinese.
So before we do step closer to the modern period, there is something that I think I brushed over a little bit too quickly there, which is part of the oral tradition here. And you said the most important part, I'm quoting here, the most important feature of oral literature is its performativity. And this brings in something that you've written a lot about over the years, and it's important to mention that a lot of this oral tradition is female oral tradition. It comes from women, and of course a lot of the oral tradition comes from shamans, and many of the shamans across Korean Peninsula are women. But women across this literature, as you write also, have had a marginalized place within Korean literature. But this oral tradition goes...
Indeed.
So I might get you to take us back to that oral tradition and just how deep women have a role within Korean literature, even if it's been whitewashed over the...
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned shamans. I prefer the term mudang, or the honorific term manshin, which literally means 10,000 spirits. I can only conjecture. I mean, apart from the monopoly on learning in classical Chinese by men, I think that continues to be the best possible reason that women stuck with the native language to express themselves. How it is that women came to adopt the primary function of native spirituality in Korea, and that is to link those of us still alive on the earth with the souls of the departed. I'm not in a very good position to speculate on that, but the fact is that over the centuries, the role of the mudang, which is by definition female, the male practitioners are referred to as paksu. They have a different designation. But the achievements are such that we have a distinct genre of oral literature consisting of the narratives of the mudang as they perform their rituals, and the Korean term for this is mu-ga. Once again, the ga for song, and mu indicating the practitioner of native spirituality. You may be familiar with the Pari Kongju story. Pari Kongju, often called the abandoned princess, and her journey from abandonment to being taken under the wing of a Taoist wizard, then returning to her family, to her royal family, to save her mother and father, which is something that her older sisters could not do, has become, has kind of established Parikonjo as the patron saint of practitioners of native spirituality in Korea, and it's become a very viable form of oral literature that persists today, even as the function of Mudang continues to be vital. You might have heard the anecdote about Kim Young-ha. One of his occasional columns for the New York Times reminds us that even the men who run the chaebol, the conglomerate, sometimes consult with Mudang before making an important business decision. So, but getting back to the main point, the practice of native spirituality has indeed been a kind of a means of social mobility for Mudang, and this point was made clear in one of the very best English language books of Korean studies, which consisted of case studies of 6 Mudang by Young-soo Kim Harvey, who regrettably died early. But 6 Korean women gives a very good idea of how women use their spiritual expertise to develop a literary genre in addition to their fundamental service of linking individuals with their deceased family members.
So when I look at this period, I am struck by a thought. I read as much as I could in the last 2 weeks preparing for this, and I have a feeling, and I think you mentioned it somewhere in your work as well, that a lot of this literature before the modern period, it has a heavy focus on romance. So is that something that does come out within the literature? And on that as well, how significant are the influences here of Confucianism and Buddhism throughout this literature?
Okay. Well, the more we become familiar with Korean culture, the more familiar we become with the coexistence of various bodies of spirituality and ideology. Again, Buddhism was an early arrival on the Korean Peninsula. Among the common people, among the great majority of the people of Chosun, to be sure, common people saw in Buddhism a much more flexible and liberal and accepting spirituality, whereas Confucianism, which probably more accurately termed Neo-Confucianism, based on the thought of Jushi, which was introduced onto the Korean Peninsula during the Koryo period, became the official ideology of Chosun. So Confucianism became tied with the elite, the educated, the literate. Buddhism perhaps was more congenial to those who were not literate, not elite. But we have to remember that that even the elite, the members of the privileged class, took solace in Buddhism. So rather than seeing these various spiritualities as competing, I think practically we have to see how they interacted, even though over the centuries, native spirituality and its practitioners were looked down upon by the elite. Practitioners of native spirituality were not part of the traditional class system of scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants. And their status, like other outcast groups, was hereditary. But in spite of the class system, I think it's important to remember that these three bodies of spirituality and ideology complemented each other, and one might argue have survived into the new millennium. And we should probably not forget that there's a pretty good admixture of Taoism in there as well.
So that step towards this watershed moment, this change into modern literature. And you write that there are two really important moments that happen here. The first is, of course, the Enlightenment and modernization that comes across East Asia at the turn of the 20th century. But also, and very importantly, and many people may not be aware of this, it's the annexation of Korea by Japan. This suddenly gives Koreans, as you wrote somewhere else, that it gives them suddenly an acute awareness of themselves and something to focus on around Hangul. So let's go to that moment there when this literature turns into the modern period and those influences that push this change and what it looks like.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it bears remembering that Chosun, as far as I know, was the first and perhaps remains the only sovereign state to be colonized by a non-Western power. And the fact that the colonizer was not the traditional big brother China, but rather historically a comparative upstart, Japan, was of course all the more galling. And so it makes perfect sense that those involved in cultural nationalism would embrace the native script once and for all. So how did the change from a pre-modern or a traditional literary tradition to a modern tradition take place? There's still debate about when this started. Our colleagues in Korea like to see the beginnings of change in the mid-1800s, at a time when the Prince Regent, the Taewon-gun, who was exercising power at that time because the king was still in his minority, had already become aware of the possibility of encroachments by foreign powers. And so the literature, especially the fictional narratives and also the verse, began to see a widening of practitioners and perhaps a little more sensitivity to issues of class division. But once the Enlightenment period starts and knowledge starts flooding onto the Korean Peninsula, it had already been coming in for quite some time from China by way of Catholicism, but the winds of intellectual and artistic change coming in by way of Japan, which it's widely agreed were funneled in from the West through Japan, presented the people of Chosun, and of course after 1910 we can refer to them as the people of Korea, with new genres in which to create. And as someone whose specialty has always been in modern fiction, it has remained kind of miraculous to me how quickly Korean fiction writers were able to adopt the Western short story genre. So fiction, so-so, goes way back in Korea, but it was never differentiated in terms of length, which is why even today in the dictionary you'll see the word so-so glossed as novel. And that's incorrect because the novel specifically refers to the Jongpyeon so-so, which we sometimes hear from Korea as the full-length novel, which is which is a redundancy. But the point is that not until the modern period do we begin to think of novels, short fiction, and novellas, Jongpyeon so-so. So the first works of short fiction that are recognizably Western in form date from the teens, and the 1917 is the year that is often targeted as the birth of modern Korean fiction in the form of a novel, a Jongpyeon so-so, called Mujang, which I understand as heartlessness. Others refer to it as the heartless. But we should remember that in that same year, 1917, a short story was published by a female writer, Kim Young-sun, called Wishime Chonya, which could be understood as a suspicious young woman or a suspicious girl, or a girl in a suspicious context or situation. And this is a story with traditional content, that is a man who, in addition to his legal wife, has a second wife or a concubine, a chaganchip, colloquially, the little woman, the little house. So at the very beginnings of what is now commonly accepted as the birth of modern Korean fiction, we have a distinctive short story by a woman writer and a historic novel by a male writer. This could get me going on Korean women's writing in the modern period, but perhaps I should defer to you before going further.
We can get to the women in a little bit later, actually, because there is a lot to speak about when it comes to modern Korean literature. But you were talking about those teens, and of course, let's talk about what happens to the literature in that period. You talk about the Western influences and what it looks like, and you write here of just how important drama is. This idea of playwrights and drama. So I suppose the question I'm trying to get to is how influenced by Western literature did the actual literature of inside Korea at the time become? Because you write again that it suddenly became strongly realistic, and this is a lot of French and Russian influences seeping into the language. So I suppose the question I'm trying to come to is how did the literature itself change? How much of it stayed Korean, and how much of it was being changed from these outside influences and the new cultures coming in?
Okay, so this I'll try not to get carried away by this, but we're talking about three genres in the modern period, which is how the what is Korean literature is. It's how the part two of the modern period is structured: fiction, poetry, and drama. So. Fiction we can think of as as coming from a very long tradition of fictional narratives in both Chinese and in Hangul, starting in the 1400s, but very heavily influenced by the Western short story, particularly and what Korean readers and writers found kind of familiar among the Western short story were those coming from societies and cultures like their own that had recently involved class issues or conflict with other nations, and French short fiction and Russian short fiction are usually thought of as models that Korean writers found congenial. As far as the novel is concerned, the novel tended to remain more traditional in content and was not valued as much as the short story. Why? Because novels were commonly serialized in newspapers, and then later, with the advent of literary journals, they were serialized literary journals. Serialization in newspapers to the very conservative and elite and patriarchal Korean literature establishment power structure smacks of lowbrow readership. So distinction can be made between short fiction and novels. Short fiction is displaying, at least at the beginning, more foreign influence. Novels displaying more native influence. Poetry, the poetry tradition, the lyric tradition in Korea is so strong that there's no way that poetry could develop into something completely different. And yet, and this point has been made clear by Kevin O'Rourke over the decades, the introduction, again by way of Japan, of imagism, primarily from England and also from France, introduced a conceptual element to Korean poetry that was always present in poetry written in Chinese, but was somewhat different from native verse, which, and again, this is a stereotype, is colored more by what we refer to as jungso, or affect, feeling, lyricism. So again, kind of a dual influence. With theater, the original influence was from Japan. So the first, I'd say the first decade or two of modern drama consists of influence from Japanese, from stage performances. But interestingly, Korean dramatists, playwrights soon kind of transcended that influence, and for much of the colonial period, concentrated on dramatic literature, that is, drama that exists more in written form on the printed page than on the stage. So to be sure, there were touring companies, but their activities became increasingly constrained during the colonial period, especially in the mid to later 30s, as the war effort, as you probably know, exerted a lot of pressure on Korean culture. But today, drama seems to be changing more than poetry and fiction in terms of both recapturing elements of the oral tradition and in kind of co-opting foreign influences. Indeed, I believe there's been even one non-Korean dramatist who has begun making a name for himself with performances that are staged outside in appropriate cultural spaces in the city of Seoul. So I guess that, in a nutshell, is how I've seen these three broad streams of literature developing in the modern period.
Well, let's take the next step then, because of course the period of Japanese colonization ends in 1945, and of course a change seems to happen at the time that is a little bit hard to notice from the outside, but you've written about it a couple of times, and it is this idea that Korean literature is largely has been, at least recently and in many ways, a response to tragedy that happens around them. And from 1945, that's what seems to happen, at least what comes out through some of your analysis here, that there's a new generation of Korean writers that don't have such a strong memory or no memory of occupation, but still noticing hardships and struggles around them, and this new literature emerges in this period.
Yeah. It's probably best to understand this in terms of gender. And once again, if we go back to the traditional period, where the producers of recorded literature were almost entirely men, I often ask my students, especially the guys, to imagine what it would be like in Chosun to be one of the very, very, very few males in the country to be proficient in classical Chinese and to have the all-important rank in the capital that is good not just for yourself but for your family, subsequent generations of your family. And so you are in the position. You have kind of a monopoly on learning, on education, and by virtue of that, you are classified as someone with morality. And this is one of the interesting things about traditional literature, that the word for literature, munok, was originally understood as mastery of writing by a person endowed with morality, with ethics, with virtue. And it's only in the modern period that munok takes on its meaning as a creative enterprise. So my suggestion is that early on the literatus assumed the duty of educating the people, the Peksung, the 100 clans, the people, by virtue of his knowledge, and that kind of element of didacticism persists in the modern period. And I would say even today in writers like Lee Mun-yeol, who is one of the few Korean fiction writers to have an audience outside of Korea. So in the modern period, didacticism is how we see it manifested is in the writing of people who call readers' attentions to ongoing issues. It could be gender issues, class issues, political issues, and the variety of approaches of this sort could range from commentary that's very skillfully embedded into a compelling narrative, it could, on the one hand, to a rather obvious call for awareness on the part of readers of all of the upheavals of modern Korean history. This kind of capacity for reflection on Korea's tragic history, as it's often explicitly stated, is encapsulated in a concept by the Korean literature power structure called Yaksa Ishik, which could be translated as historical consciousness. So the expectation is, by the Korean literature power structure, that writers of fiction will embody in their writing a historical consciousness. And that approach, I think, cuts across genders, although it's probably more associated with fiction by men. But it maintains a strong presence in Korean fiction into the new millennium. Although this would be the subject for another question, we are beginning to see quite a few more elements of genre fiction emerging in Korean fiction.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Out podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.